Let's talk about the Wagner Group.
Secretive Russian mercenary group.
A shadowy private security company that has ties to the Kremlin.
Wagner Group has a gruesome reputation.
The Wagner Group has been around for about 10 years. And its forces have shown up in all sorts of places, from Syria to Mali to Mozambique.
What Wagner is doing is essentially acting as a proxy for the Russian government in different armed conflicts.
And recently, they've been getting a lot of attention because of what they're doing in Ukraine.
Wagner went from being this small, kind of special forces like mercenary group in Africa to sort of large cannon fodder on the fields of Ukraine.
So what do we actually know about the Wagner Group? What it does, where it operates, and who's behind it? Now, the Wagner Group is secretive and hard to define, but basically, they get paid to send their armed personnel to different countries. You could say that makes them mercenaries, but that word has a legal definition that doesn't always fit with what they do. They're also often described as a PMC, a private military company, but that doesn't quite fit either, because Wagner isn't just one company.
It's better thought of as a loose network of companies, financial intermediaries that are all linked together in as opaque a way as possible so as to make it difficult to understand what their financial and organizational links are and to make it very difficult to hold them accountable for their actions.
Now, the group first appeared in 2014 when Russia illegally annexed Crimea and sided with pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine. Footage of masked soldiers in unmarked uniforms started cropping up. People were calling them little green men, and at least some of them were linked to the Wagner Group. Now, the group's name is in reference to the German composer Richard Wagner, who was Hitler's favorite. And Wagner was apparently the battlefield call sign used by a guy named Dmitry Utkin, who used to be a special forces officer in the Russian military. He's often been talked about as the group's founder and is reportedly still involved. But the man you really need to know about is Yevgeny Prigozhin, a Russian oligarch. For years, he denied having any links to the Wagner Group. But recently, that changed. In late 2022, he came out of the shadows. There are now several videos of Prigozhin at work, with his forces on the ground and trying to sign up new recruits.
Парни, записывайтесь в ЧВК Wagner. Дружный коллектив, научитесь мужской работе.
Prigozhin also published this statement claiming that he founded the group back in 2014. He officially registered the company as a consulting business and opened up a flashy new headquarters in St. Petersburg.
Which is significant not only for being Wagner's first official headquarters, first formal existence on paper and on property, but also for the fact that it is located on Russian soil, where PMCs are technically illegal.
Наемничество – это уголовная статья. Вместе с тем, Пригожин работает в связке с Министерством обороны Российской Федерации, в связке с российскими спецслужбами, пользуется, очевидно, покровительством со стороны первых государства, включая президента Владимира Путина.
Now, Prigozhin's relationship with Putin goes back to the 1990s. They're from the same city of St. Petersburg, where Prigozhin went from selling hot dogs to owning several restaurants. And Putin was a regular customer. After becoming president, he brought along some pretty well-known dignitaries, and Prigozhin picked up the nickname of Putin's chef. Soon, he was scoring some pretty lucrative catering contracts, including for the Russian military. Over the years, he's become super rich, politically influential, and has built up a media empire too.
Биография Евгения Пригожина – это довольно стандартная биография петербургского бандита, который сумел из самых низов подняться до вершин государственной власти.
Okay, now back to the Wagner Group itself. Since they first popped up in Ukraine in 2014, the Wagner Group has been active in at least 8 other countries. They're the ones that we know of for sure anyway. So for example, in Syria, they're supporting the forces of President Bashar al-Assad. The Russian army's there too. While in Venezuela, another Russian ally, Wagner went in 2019 as a protection force for President Nicolás Maduro, who was facing huge protests. And on the African continent, well, that's where the Wagner Group has really honed its business model.
We've seen this be a targeted effort against countries with weak governance, ongoing security challenges, oftentimes an authoritarian or military government, and rich natural resources that they can exploit as part of that deal, often through mining concessions.
Diamond mines, gold mines, oil, stuff like that. And so that's their business model. In exchange for extractive industry, they will provide muscle and protection.
But it's more than that, because there are political interests mixed in there too. And that's because of the Wagner Group's connection to the Russian government.
The thing with Wagner is it's part of Russia's strategy in terms of how to build its influence in the African continent and trying to cast themselves as an alternative to the West, especially in contexts where Western-led solutions have failed. The political relationship supports the security relationship. The security relationship reinforces the political relationship.
Take the Central African Republic, for example. In 2017, the president, Faustin Archange Touadéra, turned to Russia for help to fight various rebel groups. Russia sent weapons and military instructors, and Wagner went in too.
Along with those formal Russian deployments, many of the so-called trainers that went in and additional forces that would go in over time were actually Wagner troops.
Then, in 2018, a company linked to Prigozhin was granted diamond and gold mining licenses. And over time, the Wagner Group has become even more prominent in the CAR.
Before the last elections, we actually see active Russian mercenaries in combat gear and with weapons escorting the president as he goes around campaigning before the elections, right? So that is as blatant as it gets.
We really see them deeply integrated into the running of more or less the country. There have been some reports from individuals on the ground that when a person reaches out to more or less the local equivalent of 911, what they get on the other end is Wagner personnel.
The UN believes there are now several thousand Wagner operatives in the CAR and says that along with other forces, they've been committing human rights abuses, including arbitrary detention, torture, disappearances, and summary execution. And we see this kind of thing in other places where Wagner is operating too.
Wherever they go, there's a trail of human rights abuse and violations.
Like in Mali, where the Wagner Group has been active since 2021. In the town of Mora, Wagner forces and Mali's military are accused of having executed several hundred people.
What we've seen in Mali is that Wagner was being deployed to deal with insurgency. So it was being deployed as, in essence, a counterterrorism response. Now, that in itself is not problematic, but the problem is that an entire population is being targeted and tagged as terrorists.
Now, the likelihood of any kind of accountability when it comes to the Wagner Group's activities is next to zero, especially when government forces are also involved.
Local forces are complicit or participating alongside Wagner, and so it's very difficult to externally impose some kind of accountability.
Even if we did have good international laws against mercenaries, who's going to go into Mali and arrest all those mercenaries, or Libya and arrest all those mercenaries? Not the United Nations, not NATO. Nobody's going to do it.
Okay, so that's a snapshot of how Wagner's been operating around the world. But now let's look at Ukraine, because they're being used there in a very different way, on a different scale, and Wagner has been making a difference on the Russian side. For example, it was Wagner, not the Russian army, that made the first significant Russian gain in months when they captured the town of Soledar back in January.
We see Wagner operating more or less as a military unit, an informal unit of the Russian military, and we particularly see them taking the lead in areas such as Bakhmut, where they've essentially turned their operations just into cannon fodder. They're fighting to hold the front lines and to take territory there.
But that takes a lot of men. We're talking tens of thousands. And the US estimates that 90% of them are Russian convicts recruited from prisons who've been promised freedom if they served 6 months on the battlefield. Although Prigozhin says he's now stopped recruiting prisoners.
It's not about broad, efficient military strategy. It is throwing bodies at a problem. And there are absolutely horrific stories of how these soldiers are being used by the Wagner Group.
По-русски сказать. Все пути к Артемовску пробивали, грубо говоря, просто по телам, по трупам своих же. Потери были большие,
Now, this new overt way that Wagner is operating in Ukraine introduces some new challenges for the group and for the Russian government, who've always denied they exist, officially at least. And this is one of the main reasons why Wagner's been so useful to Russia.
They were really the Kremlin's weapon of choice because they gave great plausible deniability to the Kremlin in case things went badly.
Some new rivalries have opened up too, especially between Prigozhin and Russia's top military leaders. Recently, he accused them of treason for not supplying his men with enough ammunition. And it's got a lot of people talking about what Prigozhin's strategy might be.
Это человек, не имеющий никакого формального статуса в российской государственной власти, но де-факто обладающий большим влиянием, чем многие федеральные министры, а может быть даже и вице-премьеры.
I think we see that his strategic vision for the Wagner Group is growing, and his own ambitions of political power and influence are growing. And I think that he's using the opportunity of the Ukraine war and the Wagner Group's role in the fighting to really propel himself forward and to pursue those ambitions.
Prigozhin imagines himself as sitting at the right hand of the Tsar Putin. And this has created rivalries within the Siloviki, within the Russian military establishment, because this outsider is now getting the attention of Putin. But I think Prigozhin's stock is only as good as his delivery of victories.
We actually put together a whole episode about Vladimir Putin, explaining his rise to power and his worldview. You can check it out here.